Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is California Proposition 50, and it's a ballot measure that really forces a difficult choice. We're looking at state constitutional integrity versus, well, responding strategically to a pretty severe national political crisis.
Exactly. The central question, as I see it, is should California temporarily suspend the authority of its Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, the CRC, and actually allow the legislature to draw new congressional maps? This is framed specifically as a targeted countermeasure against, the extreme partisan gerrymandering we've seen in states like Texas and Florida.
That's right, and I'll be arguing today that this countermeasure isn't just justified, but it's actually necessary and principled if we want to restore fair national representation in the House.
And I'm going to take the opposing view. I'll assert that Proposition 50 dangerously sacrifices what many consider California's gold standard of nonpartisan redistricting. I think it ultimately betrays voter trust and, frankly, sets a profoundly destabilizing constitutional precedent.
Okay, so let me begin by detailing the scale of the crisis we're facing nationally. There's analysis from the Brennan Center for Justice, and it reveals that sustained partisan bias alone has created an advantage, something like at least 16 to 17 congressional seats nationally. And look, this distortion, it's not incidental. It's the result of a calculated, asymmetric political strategy that's being deployed in single-party controlled states. These states are, well, they're effectively locking in unaccountable power for an entire decade.
The urgency of that national data. Look, it's undeniable. I grant you that. But the solution proposed by Prop 50, it just fundamentally contradicts the core principles that California voters enshrined in our state constitution. We really have to ground this discussion in the Voters' First Act of 2008. That was a direct constitutional amendment. By a majority vote, Californians deliberately stripped the power of drawing electoral maps away from incumbent politicians, and they vested it in the independent 14-member Citizens Redistricting Commission. Prop 50 represents a complete, even if they say temporary, abandonment of this structure that voters mandated.
Well, I do respect the commitment to the Voters' First Act. I really do. But federal inaction kind of demands a defensive response here. With Congress unable to pass national solutions like the Freedom to Vote Act and the Supreme Court refusing to step in on partisan gerrymandering in that Rucho versus Common Cause case, well, states that are committed to fairness, they have to respond somehow. And Prop 50, I argue, isn't just partisan retaliation. It's a defensive necessity. And critically, any new maps drawn by the legislature would be governed by the strict common cause fairness criteria. This ensures proportionality, it mandates robust public participation, requires racial equity protections, and it's explicitly tied to endorsing long-term federal reform. So the intent here is principled defense, not just raw partisan gain.
But that defense requires substituting a citizen-led, bipartisan body, the CRC, with the very politicians the Voters' First Act was created to sideline in the first place. The Citizens Redistricting Commission is the established model of accountable, public-facing, nonpartisan governance. Proposition 50 substitutes the CRC's fair maps with districts drawn by the legislature solely for the purpose, let's be honest, of maximizing or protecting one party's seats. This action directly sacrifices the credibility of our independent model, the very model we champion nationwide, for what, a short-term political fight?
Right, but the critical issue here, I think, is that maintaining a rigid, sort of nonpartisan stance, while other major states are actively stacking the deck against fair representation, well, it amounts to what some experts call unilateral political disarmament. Just standing by. This passive position, it allows these, frankly, authoritarian efforts to undermine national representation without any challenge. The goal here is to restore the national map so it more accurately reflects the aggregate national vote share, which, as the Brennan Center data shows, is severely skewed right now. This is meant as a proportional response.
I have to challenge this premise of temporary adjustment, though. Proposition 50 grants this map drawing authority for 3 full federal election cycles. That's 2026, 2028, and 2030, 6 years. Well, 6 years is a significant period that locks in partisan advantage, and it sets, I believe, a deeply destructive precedent. It basically signals to voters that a constitutional amendment, one approved by the people themselves, can just be tossed aside whenever it becomes politically inconvenient for the incumbents. That fundamentally undermines the long-term stability and credibility of independent redistricting in California.
I agree that 6 years is substantial. It's not insignificant. But the mechanism here is explicitly designed to preserve the long-term will of the voters. As analyzed by UCLA law, the power being used here is a legislative constitutional amendment, which is actually a tool voters already empower the legislature to propose. And crucially, Prop 50 mandates that this new legislative authority expires. It does so automatically after the 2030 census, and then the CRC resumes its function for the next map drawing cycle. So this structural limit, it ensures the constitutional change is temporary and defensive. And that distinguishes it sharply, I think, from the permanent gerrymandering efforts we're trying to respond to in other states.
I'm just not convinced that a sunset clause really mitigates the immediate institutional damage. If California, the supposed champion of independent commissions, resorts to legislative map drawing, even if guided by common cause criteria, we erode the conceptual clarity that the CRC provides. This action risks making California just another contributor to partisan gerrymandering, really eroding the very reform model we advocate for nationwide. And, let's not forget, drawing new maps, requiring special elections, managing the inevitable litigation. This will cost millions of taxpayer dollars. We'd be gambling on a partisan electoral war when we already have a system that's transparent and functional.
Okay, the financial cost is a valid concern, yes. But the cost of allowing this systemic distortion to continue unchecked, well, that seems far greater for the future of democratic accountability. But let's address the idea of tarnishing the model. The Independent Commission, while it's effective at the state level, it's really a means to an end. And that end is fair representation. It's not the commission itself. So when the national environment is fundamentally distorted, just standing by while the overall fairness of representation is compromised, that seems insufficient. If the rest of the country isn't adopting the model and the national result is the systemic partisan bias netting, 16 or 17 extra seats, then our model, while it's internally sound, is frankly externally ineffective at protecting the principle of fair representation across the nation.
Well, that perspective suggests that the end justifies the means, doesn't it? But the means chosen here are, I think, fundamentally toxic to institutional trust. The Voters First Act was established specifically because legislative map drawing is inherently conflictual and, let's face it, self-serving. No amount of criteria can really sanitize the intent when you return the power to the very body whose electoral survival depends on the outcome. It really is fighting fire with fire, and that's a practice that, often consumes the firefighter along with the flames.
But those common cause criteria are highly restrictive. They require proportionality. They specifically mandate protections for communities of color under the Federal Voting Rights Act. So if we can achieve fairer national representation while adhering to these nonpartisan standards, aren't we simply using the legal power voters delegated to the legislature through the amendment process to defend the principle of fair representation on a national scale? I think that's a crucial distinction. Principled defense versus pure partisan advantage.
I suppose I just come at it from a different perspective regarding the long-term cost. Look, while the voters absolutely have the legal right to amend the Constitution, the question here is one of prudence, of institutional stability. Using this power to bypass the Voters First Act, it's destructive to the long-term stability of the Commission's authority. Once you set the precedent that the CRC can be overridden when it's politically expedient, its authority is, I believe, permanently weakened, regardless of any 2030 sunset clause. The integrity of the process itself is paramount.
So let me ask you this then. If the maps created under Prop 50 strictly meet those proportionality standards advocated by nonpartisan groups, like Common Cause, but maybe their creation does tarnish the perception of the CRC's independence, have we truly advanced the cause of fair representation overall?
That's exactly the tension, isn't it? My answer would be no, because you've damaged the long-term institutional health for a short-term gain that relies on adopting the very practices we claim to oppose. It creates cynicism.
Well, we also have to consider the immediate reality. The maps drawn in Texas and elsewhere, they are not principled. They're designed to maximize power through intentional extreme distortion. Prop 50 offers a time-limited corrective mechanism. If California just stands as the sole state refusing to address a systemically unfair national map, then its commitment to fairness really only exists within its own borders. I argue we are defending the democratic principle itself, using constraints that prevent us from sinking to the level of the worst offenders.
Okay, I have one final question for you. Proponents of national reform, they often advocate for a total ban on mid-decade redistricting, right? Doesn't California's willingness to engage in this precise practice, even if you frame it defensively, actually reduce the pressure on Congress to pass the very national reform solutions we both seem to agree are ultimately necessary?
That's a thoughtful point, but those national solutions have repeatedly failed to materialize, haven't they? And the political harm is happening right now. So Prop 50, I see it as acting as a necessary bridge. By conditioning its new maps on a legislative endorsement of future federal reform, California is signaling, I think, that this is a temporary defensive measure, not some permanent retreat from the ideal of independent commissions. The urgency of the threat, in my view, outweighs the potential long-term risk of a slightly weakened institutional precedent, particularly when that precedent is legally limited to expire in 2030.
So we've certainly explored the deep tension here, haven't we, between reacting to these external threats and upholding internal state constitutional principles. I still maintain that California voters must respect the will of the people expressed back in 2008 by defending the integrity and the nonpartisan nature of the Citizens Redistricting Commission. Rejecting Prop 50, for me, sends a clear message that California will not sacrifice its independent process, what many call the nation's gold standard, for short-term political gain or engage in the, frankly, corrosive and costly practice of fighting fire with fire.
And the debate, I agree, centers squarely on whether fairness is defined locally or nationally. The empirical evidence, particularly from the Brennan Center, demonstrates a deep structural imbalance in Congress that fundamentally compromises the concept of fair representation for all Americans. Prop 50 is proposed as a measured, temporary action guided by strict common cause fairness criteria and a defined expiration date tied to the 2030 census. From my side, it is a necessary choice to prevent what amounts to unilateral political disarmament in the face of these ongoing aggressive attacks on fair representation coming from single-party controlled states.
It really forces Californians to choose, doesn't it, between protecting the integrity of their own independent, voter-approved institution and taking what some see as a pragmatic step to defend the national principle of proportional representation.
Exactly. And the choice boils down to whether California will be a passive bystander to what looks like a national constitutional breakdown, or if it will be an active, principled defender of balanced representation, even if it requires a difficult temporary measure.
Well, I think we've successfully eliminated both the strong commitment to the Voters First Act and the pragmatic, principled argument for considering a national countermeasure.
Yes, hopefully listeners now have a more robust framework for reflecting on whether the severity of the national crisis justifies what would be a temporary institutional compromise here in California. Further insights, I think, can only really be gained from continued study of the structural imbalances detailed in the source material we've discussed.